In 1952, inside a Harlem nightclub packed with 200 people, fear froze the air when Bumpy Johnson stood up. A Chicago enforcer walked in furious arrogance, certain his reputation could bend any room. What followed wasn't a gunfight. It was humiliation measured in 10 seconds and absolute silence. How did one man turn public rage into power and make a legend kneel without firing a shot? On October 14th in 1952, Harlem was not looking for trouble. It had already buried enough men that year. Enough names had already been whispered instead of spoken out loud. That Tuesday night was supposed to pass unnoticed. Harlem knew how to keep nights quiet. Decades of police pressure, internal wars, and unwanted attention had taught the neighborhood discipline. Loud nights brought headlines. Headlines brought raids. Raids brought funerals. Silence was not weakness, it was survival. Small's Paradise sat at the center of that survival. Not officially, not on any document, but everyone understood its role. Deals were not announced there, but they were acknowledged. Reputations were not built there, but they were confirmed or quietly erased. That night the club was full. Nearly 200 people packed shoulder to shoulder, filled every table and lined the bar from end to end. The band played, slowly, confidently. Nothing in the room suggested urgency. Nothing suggested danger. Then the door opened. The man who walked in did not pause. He did not hesitate, did not look for permission, did not adjust his pace. He stepped forward, immediately moving as if the room had already accepted him. His suit was tailored, expensive, chosen to be noticed without explanation. 3 men followed him inside. Not bodyguards in the traditional sense, more like proof. They stayed close enough to matter, far enough to signal that he wasn't concerned. They did not scan the room. They did not need to. The shift inside Smalls was subtle and immediate. Conversations didn't stop all at once. They thinned. One table at a time. One voice lowering before another followed. The band kept playing, but the tempo softened as if someone had gently pressed a hand against the music. No one recognized the man. That wasn't the problem. In Harlem, recognition mattered less than behavior, and this man walked as if resistance was unlikely, as if compliance had already been negotiated somewhere else. He reached the bar and placed his hand down without acknowledgement. He snapped his fingers once, sharp, impatient, and spoke without waiting. The tone wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It assumed obedience. The bartender did not respond. He had been pouring drinks in Harlem since before most of the room had learned the cost of attention. He did not argue. He did not explain policy. He simply looked at the man's hand on the bar and then at his face. He stayed still. That stillness spread. The room did not react emotionally. No shouts. No sudden movement. Harlem did not flare up when challenged. It observed. Who is he? Why is he here? Who does he think he's addressing? The man leaned forward, irritation now visible. He was used to resistance, showing itself quickly, loudly, violently, predictably. This was none of those things. This felt like being studied. He laughed once, short, dismissive. Then he spoke again. 2 words, careless, revealing. You people. The reaction was immediate and quiet. A woman near the back shifted away from her table. A man by the window folded his newspaper and did not look up again. Someone stood near the wall and remained standing. No one met the stranger's eyes. This was not outrage. It was calculation. The man at the bar misunderstood it. He mistook silence for hesitation. He raised his voice slightly, repeating himself, letting frustration surface. The music stopped. Not because the band chose to, because the room had already decided it was over. At that moment, Small's Paradise stopped being a nightclub. It became something else entirely, a closed system, measuring a threat. In the far corner, a man who had been sitting quietly since before the door opened, set his glass down. He did not rush. He did not speak. He simply looked at the stranger with sustained attention. Those who recognized him did not move. Those who didn't still felt the shift. Harlem had seen men enter rooms believing reputation alone would protect them. Some left unchanged. Others did not leave at all. This night had not reached that point yet, but it was moving toward it steadily. In neighborhoods shaped by prolonged violence, silence was never empty. It was full of memory. And memory in Harlem had a way of deciding who walked out and who didn't. Disrespect rarely announces itself as violence. It enters a room quietly, carried by tone rather than threat, by posture rather than action. In Harlem, that difference was understood instinctively. Tone revealed intention long before consequences followed. Vincent Torrio spoke to the bartender the way men spoke in places where resistance had already been trained out of people. He leaned forward, rested his hand flat on the bar, and snapped his fingers once. The sound was sharp, impatient, and deliberate. It was meant to establish hierarchy without discussion. "Bourbon," he said. The word carried no politeness and no uncertainty. It was not a request. It was an expectation stated out loud. The bartender did not move. He didn't reach for a bottle or acknowledge the order. He remained exactly where he was, eyes steady, hands still. His name was Jackson, and he had been working Harlem bars long enough to recognize patterns before they became problems. He had seen nights escalate over smaller things and men disappear for larger ones. Experience had taught him that some moments demanded speed and others demanded restraint. This was the second kind. Jackson looked at Torrio's hand on the bar and then at his face. There was no challenge in his expression, and no apology either. He said nothing because silence in Harlem was sometimes the clearest answer. Torrio misread it. He leaned closer, irritation creeping into his posture, and repeated himself. "You deaf?" he asked, keeping his voice controlled. "I said bourbon." That was when the room began to shift. Not suddenly and not loudly. Conversations lowered in volume, then thinned. A few stopped entirely. The band kept playing, but the rhythm softened as if the music itself was listening for what came next. Jackson finally spoke, his voice low and measured. "Sir," he said, choosing his words carefully. "We don't." He didn't get to finish. "I don't care what you don't," Torrio said, cutting him off. The interruption was casual but intentional. It wasn't just refusal. It was dismissal. The band faltered again. The pianist hesitated before correcting himself, and the drummer eased off the beat. Musicians who worked Harlem clubs learned early how to read rooms that carried history in their walls. Torrio straightened slightly and looked around for the first time. Nearly 200 people were watching him now. Not openly and not with hostility. With recognition. Not recognition of who he was. Recognition of what he was doing. Torrio smiled, believing the room was reacting the way rooms always did. "What's the problem?" he asked, projecting his voice just enough. "You people don't serve Italians here." The phrase was deliberate. Men like Torrio did not miss a speak. Words were chosen to compress power dynamics and clarify hierarchy. In Chicago, those two words often ended conversations. In Harlem, they started something else. Jackson set the glass he had been holding down slowly. The sound carried farther than it should have. "Sir," he said, "you're going to want to leave. Right now." Torrio laughed, and the three men behind him laughed with him. The laughter was coordinated, meant to signal control and ridicule hesitation. In many places, laughter like that froze rooms into submission. Harlem did not freeze. Or what Torrio asked. "You going to call the cops?" He paused, letting the implication settle. "We own the cops in Chicago." The music stopped. Not because anyone ordered it, because the band understood the moment had passed. Silence filled Small's paradise, thick and deliberate. Every breath became audible. Every movement felt measured. 200 people listened, not reacting but calculating. Torrio felt the shift but misunderstood it. He believed the room was intimidated. He mistook discipline for fear and silence for hesitation. "Finish that sentence," he said, his voice colder now. "You were saying." The response did not come from the bartender. It came from deeper in the room, carried by a voice that did not need to raise itself to be heard. At that moment, disrespect had completed its work. It had tested the boundary and revealed which rules applied. Torrio had entered Harlem believing its rules could be bent. They could not. The silence that followed was not the pause before violence. It was the pause before authority asserted itself. Many conflicts in American crime history did not begin with gunfire. They began with tone. And in Small's Paradise on that Tuesday night in 1952, tone had just crossed a line it could not step back from. The voice did not come from the bar. It came from deeper inside the room, from a corner, where no one had raised their voice all night. It was calm and unhurried, the kind of voice that did not compete for attention because it expected it. When it spoke, the silence reorganized itself. Vincent Torrio turned toward the sound slowly, not cautiously, and not in a hurry. His eyes moved across tables and faces until they reached the back corner of Small's Paradise. That was when he saw the man who had been there before the door ever opened. Bumpy Johnson was seated in his usual booth. He had not reacted when Torrio entered. He had not moved when the bartender was disrespected or when the wrong words were spoken. He had been watching the entire time, already aware of how the night would unfold. Nothing about Bumpy Johnson announced power. He wore a plain gray suit, clean and fitted, without jewelry or ornament. His hair showed gray at the temples, and his face carried the calm of someone who had outlived most of his enemies. There was no urgency in his posture. 4 men sat with him. They were not positioned like guards and did not behave like subordinates. They were older men, quiet with the kind of stillness that came from surviving long enough to understand what mattered. These were not men chasing relevance. Harlem recognized them immediately. They were survivors of wars that never made headlines, men who had faced outsiders and internal betrayals and lived through both. Their presence did not escalate the room. It stabilized it. Torrio did not know their names, but he felt the alignment. The room, which moments earlier had felt diffuse, now subtly oriented itself toward that booth. Chairs shifted slightly. Eyes moved away from the bar. Attention recalibrated without instruction. Bumpy finished what was left in his glass and placed it on the table. The movement was slow and deliberate, as if marking a transition. Only then did he stand. He stepped out of the booth without haste. The 4 men behind him stayed seated, not because they were unprepared, but because they did not need to move yet. Bumpy took a few steps forward and stopped, leaving distance between himself and Torrio. "You were saying," he said. The words were not loud and not confrontational. They were an invitation to complete a thought that had already gone too far. The room leaned into the silence that followed. Torrio straightened his jacket. He glanced at the 3 men behind him, then back at Bumpy. "You got a problem?" he asked. "I don't think you know who you're talking to." Bumpy waited before answering. In Harlem, pauses mattered. "No," he said finally. "I don't." The word landed heavier than any insult. Torrio had survived by being known, by making sure his reputation arrived before he did. To be dismissed without curiosity unsettled him more than open hostility. "I work for Al Capone," Torrio said, emphasizing the name. It was meant to reset the room. In most cities, it still did. Bumpy nodded slightly. "Capone's in prison," he said, "and you're standing in my bar." The distance between them felt smaller now, though neither man had moved. Torrio sensed the room tightening, watching not him but the exchange. He was no longer the center of gravity. Bumpy took another step forward and stopped. "You walked in here," he said evenly, "and talked to people you don't know, like this place already belonged to you. He paused, letting the words settle. That's not how Harlem works. The four men behind him stood then, not suddenly and not aggressively, but together. The movement was coordinated, controlled, and unmistakable. Torio's men shifted in response, hands moving closer to where weapons would be. Bumpy did not look at them. His focus never left Torio. Real power did not need to announce itself. It did not rely on volume or borrowed reputation. It existed in the way a room responded without being told how. Bumpy Johnson had not introduced himself that night. He had not needed to. By the time Torio understood who he was facing, the room had already made that clear. And the test Torio believed he was administering had quietly become something else entirely. To understand what was happening inside Small's paradise that night, it was necessary to understand Harlem itself. Not the romantic version built on jazz and nightlife, but the Harlem shaped by pressure. From the 1920s through the early 1950s, this was a neighborhood forced to survive constant scrutiny, repeated crackdowns, and unwanted attention. Harlem had been hunted for decades. Police raids came without warning. Political promises arrived late and left early. Outside crews tested the streets, assuming numbers and weapons were enough to take control. Inside the neighborhood, betrayals were quieter, handled without headlines, leaving lessons instead of explanations. Over time, Harlem adapted. Loud power did not last here. Men who ruled through fear attracted attention, and attention shortened lives. The figures who endured were the ones who understood restraint, timing, and balance. Survival depended less on dominance and more on alignment. By the 1930s, Harlem had developed an unspoken system. It was never written down, never formally enforced, but widely understood. Those who protected the community were protected in return. Those who exploited it found themselves isolated quickly. This was not ideology or sentiment, it was practicality. Chicago operated under a different logic. Power flowed downward, enforced through reputation and fear. Orders were obeyed because disobedience was costly and visible. It was efficient but fragile, and it relied on distance between those who ruled and those who complied. Harlem had no such distance. Pressure from outside had compressed the neighborhood inward. People lived close enough to observe patterns and consequences in real time. Information moved quietly, but accurately. Outsiders could enter Harlem, but they could not move freely without permission they did not realize they needed. In this environment, trust became currency. Not symbolic trust, but functional trust, the kind that determined who was warned, who was backed, and who was left exposed. Men accumulated it slowly through consistent behavior and lost it all at once through miscalculation. By 1952, Harlem no longer needed to announce its rules. It enforced them through memory. That memory shaped every reaction, every silence, and every decision made inside rooms like Small's paradise. What unfolded that night was not spontaneous, it was structural. Unofficial systems, reinforced long enough, outlast written ones. Harlem had learned that lesson early and survived because of it. Vincent Torio did not come to Harlem as an individual. He came as a representative of a system. Everything about the way he carried himself, from his posture to his language, reflected the rules he had learned somewhere else. Chicago rules. In Chicago, power was vertical. It moved downward through fear, enforced by reputation and violence. Orders did not need to be explained, only obeyed. The system depended on visibility, on making examples, on making sure consequences were seen and remembered. Torio had been shaped by that model. He had risen in an environment where authority was measured by how quickly people backed away, where silence meant submission, not evaluation, where survival depended on convincing others that resistance was futile. That system had a face. For years it belonged to Al Capone. Capone's power was not subtle. It was loud, centralized, and unmistakable. His name traveled faster than his men, and fear often arrived before he did. Chicago power relied on distance. Those who enforced it lived apart from those who endured it. Violence was efficient because it was impersonal. Loyalty was optional as long as fear remained intact. Harlem functioned differently. Power in Harlem was horizontal. It did not flow from the top down but across the community. It was reinforced daily through shared risk, shared memory, and shared consequences. Authority here was not claimed. It was granted slowly and could be revoked just as quietly. Where Chicago ruled through intimidation, Harlem ruled through recognition. People knew who stood up for them and who treated them as expendable. That knowledge spread faster than threats ever could. It shaped behavior long before violence was necessary. This difference mattered more than Torrio understood. In Chicago, carrying a reputation into a room often settled matters immediately. Names did the work. History did the rest. The system assumed compliance because it had been trained into people over time. Harlem did not comply automatically. It assessed. Reputation alone meant little without context. Outsiders were watched carefully, not challenged directly, until their intentions were clear. Torrio's mistake was assuming fear translated across borders. He believed Chicago power could be imported intact, that intimidation was a universal language. He believed that mentioning the right names would realign the room. Instead, it exposed the gap. In Harlem, fear was unstable currency. It bought short-term control, but it collapsed under sustained pressure. Loyalty, on the other hand, accumulated value. It created redundancy, resilience, and response without coordination. That was why Harlem survived repeated attempts at takeover. Outsiders arrived with guns and confidence. They left confused, isolated, or worse, not because Harlem was more violent, but because it was more cohesive. Chicago power demanded obedience. Harlem power demanded participation. That distinction defined what was happening inside Small's paradise. Torrio was applying pressure the only way he knew how, publicly, assertively, without hesitation. Harlem was responding the only way it ever had, quietly, collectively, and with memory. The two systems could not coexist in the same room. One required fear to function. The other neutralized fear by refusing to acknowledge it. Torrio believed escalation would force clarity. Harlem believed patience would. By the time Torrio realized the room was not reacting the way Chicago rooms did, the imbalance had already been decided. He was playing by rules that no longer applied. Power in Harlem did not announce itself with guns. It revealed itself through alignment. And in that room, alignment had already formed against him. Vincent Torrio believed he was reading the room correctly. He had done it hundreds of times before in bars, union halls, and back rooms where hesitation meant weakness. He mistook Harlem's restraint for uncertainty. That assumption became his first mistake. The first miscalculation was age. Torrio looked at Bumpy Johnson and saw a man past his prime. Gray at the temples, movements measured, voice calm. In Chicago, age often meant diminished relevance. In Harlem, age meant survival. It meant having outlived men who were faster, louder, and more violent. It meant knowing which fights mattered and which ones ended careers. Bumpy Johnson had not slowed down. He had narrowed his focus. Torrio assumed youth still carried leverage. He believed speed and aggression could overwhelm patience. What he failed to understand was that Harlem did not reward urgency. It rewarded accuracy. The second miscalculation was fear. Chicago power was built on the idea that fear traveled faster than information. A reputation once established could move through a room and do the work on its own. Torrio expected the same reaction here, but fear behaved differently in Harlem. This was a neighborhood that had already absorbed more fear than most cities could tolerate. Raids, arrests, betrayals, and disappearances had trained people not to flinch. Fear, unbacked by community consent, lost its leverage quickly. Torrio raised his voice when silence did not work. He invoked Chicago. He invoked ownership of police. He escalated publicly, believing intimidation would compress the room into submission. Instead, it clarified something else entirely. No one moved toward him. No one moved away either. Harlem did not retreat from fear it surrounded it. The third miscalculation was the most dangerous. Torrio believed he was not alone. He had arrived with 3 men armed and alert positioned, where they could act quickly. In his experience, that was enough. It was not. He looked at the men behind him and saw protection. The room looked at them and saw isolation. 3 men bound by employment, not loyalty. 3 men who would calculate survival the moment a decision had to be made. Torrio did not see what the room saw. He did not notice how many people were no longer seated. He did not register how many eyes were no longer on him, but on Bumpy Johnson. He assumed alignment came from authority. In Harlem, alignment came from history. Bumpy did not issue commands. He did not need to. The room had already decided where it stood, not because he paid them, and not because they feared him, because he had bled where they bled, because he had intervened when others exploited, because he had kept disputes contained when chaos would have drawn attention. That history did not require explanation. Torrio had no such history in that room. He had reputation, but reputation did not translate into allegiance. When pressure rose, allegiance was the only currency that mattered. That was the moment the balance became undeniable. Torrio was surrounded by people who would not die for him. Bumpy Johnson stood in a room full of people who already had. The difference was not numerical. It was structural. One man stood on borrowed fear. The other stood on accumulated trust. Torrio sensed the shift but had no way to reverse it. Escalation would isolate him further. Retreat would confirm weakness. Every option available to him narrowed the moment he realized he had misjudged the room. The 3 miscalculations converged at once. Age had been mistaken for decline. Fear had been mistaken for control. Company had been mistaken for support. By the time Torrio understood the truth, it was already operational. Harlem had aligned quietly and completely. And alignment, once formed, did not need to announce itself. The room did not explode. It inverted. The shift began without a signal anyone could point to afterward. No shouted orders, no sudden rush. Just a quiet, synchronized understanding that whatever this moment was, it had crossed a threshold. Time compressed, not because anyone counted it, but because the room stopped allowing delays. It happened in less than 5 seconds. The bartender moved first, but not quickly. He reached beneath the bar and lifted a short, heavy object that had not been there a moment before. The action was practiced, not reactive, as if it had been rehearsed in silence. No one gasped. At the piano, the player's hands left the keys and disappeared briefly into the instrument's open frame. When they re-emerged, they held a weapon that had been waiting exactly where it needed to be. The bench scraped the floor as he stood, and the sound carried farther than the metal itself. 2 waiters dropped their trays at nearly the same time. Glass-shattered ice scattered, and neither man flinched. Each of them came up holding something concealed beneath white cloth and routine. The movement was smooth, unhurried, and unmistakable. Then it spread. A woman in a red dress 3 tables back reached into her purse and brought her arm up level. A man by the window folded his newspaper once more, set it aside, and revealed what had been hidden behind the print. Near the kitchen door, a cook stepped forward holding something long and dark that changed the way the room breathed. Weapons appeared not as a display, but as a fact. By the time Vincent Torrio's eyes finished tracking the first few movements, there were more than 20 barrels pointed in his direction. Some were steady. Some were shaking slightly. All of them were real. No one fired. The silence that followed was heavier than the one before. This was not anticipation. It was resolution. The room had finished deciding. Torrio's hand, which had been drifting instinctively toward his jacket, froze mid-motion. He did not complete the movement. His body understood the math before his mind did. Every direction he looked reduced his options further. Time shrank. Each second that passed did not offer clarity. It removed it. What had been possibilities moments earlier collapsed into outcomes. Survival was no longer about dominance, it was about recognition. Bumpy Johnson stepped forward one pace and stopped. He did not rush the moment. He did not need to. The room had already done the work for him. "These people aren't my soldiers," he said evenly, his voice carrying without effort. "They're not on a payroll." No one moved. "They're here because this is their neighborhood," he continued. "And you treated it like it wasn't." Torrio tried to speak, but the words did not organize themselves quickly enough. His men shifted behind him, calculating angles that no longer existed. The exits had not moved. They had simply stopped being relevant. No one shouted commands. No one demanded surrender. No one needed to. The weapons stayed trained, not wavering, not advancing. This was not a firing line. It was a perimeter. Bumpy let another second pass before speaking again. "You can try to leave the way you came in," he said, "if you think that works." He didn't threaten, he didn't promise. He stated a condition. The room held still, allowing Torrio to understand the weight of it. He could imagine the sequence clearly, now a move, a reaction, a cascade he would not outpace. Even if he survived the first moment, there would not be a second. 5 seconds had been enough to close every door. Torrio's confidence drained visibly, not all at once, but in stages. His shoulders dropped slightly. His breathing changed. His eyes stopped searching for leverage and started searching for certainty. There was none. Bumpy stepped closer, just enough to reduce the space between them to something intimate and final. "You came here to see if the stories were true," he said. "Now you know." Still no one fired. This was the difference between chaos and control. The room did not want blood. It wanted acknowledgement. Violence was available, but it was not the point. Torrio's choices were nearly gone. Escalation would mean death. Silence would mean humiliation. He hesitated, and hesitation was the last option he had left. In moments like this, history rarely pauses long enough for reflection. Decisions are made before understanding catches up. The 5 seconds that mattered had already passed. What followed would not be loud, it would not be fast, but it would be irreversible. And the room waited, not impatiently, but with the calm of people who knew time was no longer on his side. Bumpy Johnson did not raise his voice when he spoke again. He didn't need to. The room was already listening, already aligned, already decided. What remained was not negotiation, but acknowledgement. "You've got a choice," he said, not as a challenge and not as a threat, as a statement of fact. The kind that carried weight because every person in the room understood the consequences without them being explained. Vincent Torrio tried to speak, but the words came out uneven. His mind was still searching for a version of events where reputation mattered, where escalation restored balance. That version no longer existed. The room had removed it. "You can try to force your way out," Bumpy continued, his tone steady. "Maybe you make it halfway. Maybe you don't." He paused, letting the room's silence complete the sentence for him. "Either way, you won't leave this place the same way you walked in." Torrio looked at the weapons again, not individually, but collectively. He saw what the room saw. Too many angles, too little space, no clean exit. His men were still behind him, but they were no longer assets. They were variables. Then Bumpy said the word, "Kneel." It landed without volume, without flourish. There was no immediate reaction from the room because none was needed. Everyone understood what the word meant. It was not about posture. It was about hierarchy. Torrio shook his head instinctively. No, he said more to himself than anyone else. In Chicago, kneeling meant surrender. It meant weakness that followed you out of the room and into every room after it. Bumpy did not argue. "You can stand," he said evenly, "or you can live." The choice was framed cleanly without emotion. There was no third option offered. The room remained still. This was not a crowd demanding humiliation. It was a community insisting on recognition. Torrio had walked in treating the space like neutral ground. The Neil would correct that assumption publicly and permanently. Time slowed again, but differently now. This was not the compression of threat, it was the stretching of consequence. Every second Torrio stayed upright deepened the damage. Every second delayed the inevitable. He looked at his men. They did not meet his eyes. Not because they were disloyal, but because loyalty had limits when survival entered the equation. They were waiting for him to decide, not for him to lead. Torrio's shoulders dropped slightly. The movement was small, but the room felt it. The last of his borrowed authority leaked out with it. What remained was the reality he had avoided since walking in. He bent one knee. The sound it made when it touched the floor carried through Small's paradise. Not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable. The second knee followed slower than the first, as if his body was still catching up to what his mind had already accepted. No one cheered. No one spoke. The room did not celebrate. Celebration would have cheapened the moment. This was not victory. It was correction. Bumpy looked down at him, not with satisfaction, but with calculation. "This isn't about you," he said quietly. "It's about where you are." Torrio swallowed and spoke again, his voice barely steady. "I apologize," he said. The words felt insufficient even as he said them. Bumpy waited. Louder. Torrio took a breath. "I apologize," he said again, this time for the room. For the disrespect. For all of it. That was enough. Bumpy stepped back, restoring distance rather than closing it. "Stand up," he said. Torrio rose slowly, his legs unsteady. His face stripped of performance. What he had lost was not physical power, but symbolic authority. The kind that could not be reclaimed by force. "This wasn't surrender," Bumpy said, his voice low. It was recognition. The room absorbed that distinction immediately. Torrio had not been defeated in a fight. He had been corrected by a community. And communities, unlike individuals, did not need to prove their point twice. As he turned toward the door, the weapons lowered quietly. Not because the threat was gone, but because it no longer needed to be visible. The message had been delivered. The Neil had done what bullets never could. It had made the truth undeniable. Vincent Torrio left New York before sunrise, not because anyone chased him, and not because anyone needed to. The message he carried north was heavier than any threat that could have followed him. He boarded a train quietly, sitting alone, replaying the night, not as it had felt, but as it would be told. Chicago was waiting. By the time Torrio arrived, the story had already begun moving ahead of him. Not in headlines and not in police reports. It traveled the way real stories did in that world, through lawyers, through intermediaries, through men who listened carefully and repeated only what mattered. Torrio did not go to a bar or a safe house. He went straight to an office where words were handled cautiously. The man who received him did not interrupt. He did not ask clarifying questions. He let Torrio speak until the story reached its natural end. There was no embellishment. Torrio described the room, the silence, the weapons, the Neil. He did not justify himself. He did not explain what he would do differently. He understood that explanations were irrelevant now. What mattered was accuracy. When he finished, the lawyer sat still for a long moment. Then he nodded once and began to write. The letter was short. There was no need for detail. The meaning was already complete. The letter traveled where Torrio could not. At that time, Al Capone was no longer issuing orders from the streets. Prison had narrowed his world, but it had not dulled his understanding. He had built an empire by recognizing patterns quickly and ignoring distractions. When the letter reached him, Capone read it once. He did not ask who had been present. He did not ask how many weapons had been drawn. He did not ask why Torrio had gone in the first place. Those were questions for men who needed reassurance. Capone was not one of them. He understood something immediately. Harlem had not responded emotionally. It had responded structurally. That distinction mattered. Capone dictated a reply. It was one sentence: "Stay out of Harlem." No explanation followed. None was required. The instruction was not about territory. It was about risk assessment. Harlem had revealed itself as a place where escalation would not produce leverage, only exposure. The message traveled back through the same quiet channels. By the time it reached Torrio, it no longer felt like an order. It felt like confirmation. Torrio did not argue. He did not lobby for reconsideration. He understood that the decision had already been absorbed into the larger system. Harlem was now categorized not as an opportunity, but as a liability. That classification spread quickly. Men who had considered testing Harlem reconsidered, not because of fear, but because of clarity. The story carried a specific lesson: reputation could enter Harlem, but it could not override it. What happened inside Small's paradise became compressed into a single image. A Chicago enforcer. A Harlem room. A Neil. The details blurred as they always did, but the outcome remained intact. Harlem was not conquered. It was not negotiated with. It corrected the intrusion and let the story do the rest. That was the part outsiders often misunderstood. Harlem did not need to advertise its strength. It allowed others to describe it for them, and the men who truly understood power never asked for more information than that. What happened inside Small's paradise was not spontaneous. It only looked that way to men who believed power revealed itself in the moment. In reality, the night had been decided long before the door opened. The room did not react. It executed. Bumpy Johnson did not survive Harlem by improvising. Improvisation belonged to men who did not plan to live long. He survived by knowing who was coming, why they were coming, and what they expected to find when they arrived. By the time Torrio stepped into the room, the outcome was already constrained. Information moved faster than people realized. In Harlem, it did not travel loudly. It traveled accurately. A word passed in the morning became a precaution by the afternoon and a contingency by nightfall. Nothing required a meeting. The bartender did not happen to have a weapon. The pianist did not instinctively reach inside his instrument. The people seated throughout the room were not coincidentally prepared. They were present because they had been asked quietly, selectively, without explanation. Preparation in Harlem did not look like mobilization. It looked like normalcy with intention. People went about their day knowing there might be trouble, and knowing what would be expected of them if it arrived. That expectation was not enforced. It was understood. Bumpy did not give orders that night. He did not need to. He had already done the work earlier when there was time to think clearly and speak carefully. By the time the moment arrived, the room was operating on shared understanding. This was the difference between reaction and design. Reaction relied on speed. Design relied on anticipation. Harlem had learned that reacting to force invited escalation, but anticipating it neutralized leverage. Preparation removed urgency from the equation. That was why the weapons appeared without chaos. No one rushed. No one shouted. The room did not fracture into individuals acting independently. It behaved like a system executing a plan it had already rehearsed mentally. Torrio never understood that part. He believed the moment created the response. He did not see the hours and days that shaped it. He mistook calm for indecision and silence for delay. Bumpy had learned early that survival depended on timing. Act too soon, and you invited attention. Act too late, and you lost control. The correct moment was always before the problem announced itself. That night, Small's paradise became a demonstration, not of violence, but of preparedness. The display was not meant to intimidate. It was meant to conclude the matter decisively. Information was the real weapon in the room. Who knew what? Who was warned? Who had time to consider their role before being forced to choose? Those advantages accumulated quietly and paid off instantly. Afterward, many described the night as inevitable. That was only partially true. It was inevitable because the groundwork had been laid correctly. Without that preparation, the same confrontation could have ended very differently. Bumpy understood something most men learned too late. Reflex was unreliable. Adrenaline distorted judgment. Survival favored those who removed surprise from the equation. By the time Torrio knelt, nothing new was happening. The final act simply revealed what had already been decided. The room did not adapt to him. It absorbed him and moved on. That was the real lesson of the night. Power did not live in the moment of confrontation. It lived in everything that happened before it. And in Harlem, the men who lasted were the ones who never waited to be tested. When Vincent Torrio walked out of Small's paradise, no one followed him. There were no shouted warnings, no threats thrown after his back, no need to prove anything further. The door closed, and the room stayed exactly where it was. Harlem did not pursue men once the message had been delivered. Inside, the weapons disappeared as quietly as they had appeared. Hands lowered, jackets closed. People returned to their seats without commentary. The moment did not linger because it was not meant to. This was not an event to be replayed. It was a correction already complete. Bumpy Johnson did not stand in the center of the room. He did not address the crowd or accept acknowledgement. He walked back to his booth, sat down, and reached for his glass. The movement was unremarkable, almost dismissive, as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. Someone near the bar began clapping. It was brief and uncertain, and it stopped quickly. Celebration would have misunderstood the nature of what had just happened. This was not victory. It was maintenance. The band resumed playing without instruction, the same song, the same tempo. Conversations restarted where they had left off. Within minutes, Small's paradise returned to its earlier rhythm, not because the night had been forgotten, but because it had been resolved. That was how Harlem marked authority, not with spectacle, but with continuity. The strongest signal of control was normalcy restored. Outside, the story began. Moving. It traveled north and west, compressed into fewer words with each telling. Details shifted, faces blurred, but the shape remained intact. A man entered Harlem, confident. He left corrected. He walked in believing the room would move for him. He left knowing some rooms never do. Harlem didn't chase him, didn't threaten him. It let the story travel. And stories, when accurate, did more work than violence ever could. For the next 16 years, no one tested that room again. Not from Chicago, not from Boston, not from anywhere that understood how power actually functioned. Harlem was no longer framed as territory. It was recognized as a system. Bumpy Johnson never referenced the night publicly. He didn't need to. Men who understood power rarely revisited moments that settled matters permanently. The point was not what happened. The point was that it didn't need to happen again. Kings did not celebrate victories. They prepared for the next test or ensured it never arrived. Small's paradise remained open. Harlem remained Harlem. And the rules stayed exactly where they had always been, unwritten, enforced, and remembered. History does not always record moments like this. They do not appear in court transcripts or official reports. But collective memory preserves what documents ignore, and in Harlem, memory was law. If stories like this matter to you, stories about real power, real history, and moments that never made the headlines, subscribe now. This channel doesn't chase noise, it documents truth. Do you think fear or loyalty creates lasting power? Tell us in the comments.